Hey everybody, this is CG Alvarez welcoming you back into E2026. Thanks so much for joining us on the live stream. We hope you enjoyed the workshop earlier from Reverend Kaylee Clark. She is an amazing presenter. If you missed it, we want you to know that all of the recordings will be available in about a week from the entire conference, so make sure to check back in there. You can go to the live stream schedule by going to womanclergyconference.com/live stream and see what else is on schedule for the rest of tonight and for tomorrow. But we want to welcome you. If you're new, we want you to drop your name in the chat. Tell us where you're from. And you can also buy shirts. We have these amazing shirts. So you can go to our online store at bonfire.com/store/WHWC. And for the next 2 weeks, you can buy merch and you can support WHWC. So I'm incredibly excited to introduce to you our workshop presenter for today. This is Reverend Zuline Gray Wilkinson, and she is going to be presenting today and walking alongside the hurting, a trauma-informed approach to preaching and pastoral care. So you are in for a treat. Continue to share the live stream so that others can also come and pop on in. And Reverend Zuline Gray, she is a change agent who has been making a difference in the quality of life for diverse populations for decades now. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Spanish from Temple University, a Master of Social Work degree from the University of Pennsylvania, a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological. She also holds a doctorate from
Drew University
Yes.
School of Theology.
So welcome, Dr. Reverend Zuline Gray Wilkinson. Tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started.
Thank you so much, Suji. I am delighted to be here. This is my first occasion to join the Wesleyan Holiness Women Clergy, and it is a privilege and a blessing. I come with a long career in the human services in the nonprofit sector, where I've done direct service in community agencies, in the welfare departments, but I've also led organizations as well. So, child welfare has been an area where I have a lot of experience, and also healthcare. I've led healthcare departments and cost centers for large centers in Philadelphia and also in Boston.
Wow.
So, I believed when I was called to ministry that it was a call to social work and to education. And I can remember the day that the Lord called me. And as I've worked in the field over these years, I've always integrated my love for the Lord and the mission that He had on my life. And I believe what it has done is to bring me full circle to this place of trying to help the body of Christ understand trauma and understand it in a way that we interpret scriptures correctly.
Yes.
So I think seminary helped with that, really did. So we want to not only be theologically correct, but we want to rightly divide the word. So the word hermeneutic comes up. How do we interpret the word that we are reading? And how then does it apply? How does this gospel then apply to hurting individuals? So I'm delighted.
We are
to
so
be able to
thankful that
share
you're
today.
here. Yeah, well, live stream viewers, you're in for a treat. Prepare to be blessed by this workshop from Reverend Dr. Zuline. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm so delighted to be here, and I would be remiss if I did not say who's walking alongside me. I am married to the Reverend Dr. John M. Wilkinson, who supports me in everything that I do. And so, babe, I'm so glad to be here, and thank you for your support. I also am grateful for the support of my family, my extended family, and my church family. My pastor, uh, Pastor Kenneth E. Shepherd, made sure that our church supported me in tangible ways to get here, as did my district and Reverend Dr. David Stevens, who is the head of our body there. So I thank the Lord that there are others who believe that the message that I will share today is important and I'm absolutely looking forward to sharing it back home. So, our title talks about trauma. Look at this picture. Do you see something different in the picture? There's a group of singers, a choir. And do you see that there's something in the background? That there's someone lurking in the background? And I suggest that sometimes trauma lurks behind smiles and praise. This is a photo that could actually be from my life. I went to a small congregation in Philadelphia, and we sang on the choir as young people as soon as we indicated that we loved the Lord and had given our hearts to Him. So I sang with grown ups as a young girl. And there was a woman who sang with us. And sometimes the door to the narthex would open and someone would stick his head through. And Sister Jolyn would get up, excuse herself from the choir, walk down our little center aisle, and out the door with her husband. We might not see her for a week or 2 or 3 or 4, but she'd come back and she would re-engage and she would take up where she left off. There was something else about Sister Jolyn. In those days, the saints would all kind of get into cars and we would pack out the cars because there weren't any seatbelt laws when I was a little girl. And so we'd have lots of people in cars and the kids would sit on the laps of the adults because that was a way of making sure that everyone got home safely after church. And we take Sister Jolyn and maybe a couple other saints who didn't have rides home. But we had to stop a half a block away to let Sister Jolyn off. And then my mother would have my father just wait there until we could see that she had gotten to her porch and safely into her home. Wow. Now, that wasn't us, but there was something going on in Sister Jolyn's house that I didn't understand. The saints who were grown-ups understood. It affected me. It was a trauma. You see, domestic violence is a dirty little secret that affects 1 in 4 women in the United States. And according to some estimates, that number is as much as 1 in 3 in a church. So that calculation means, and we'll take the 1 in 4, that if there are 200 people in your church, 200 women, 50 women in the church are dealing with domestic violence. Let that settle for a minute. 1 in 4 women dealing with domestic abuse. And then how many children are we talking about? Because even though the partner may be the recipient of the abuse by their intimate partner, the children are affected as well. So behind the smiles, behind the praise, lurks danger sometimes. So today, I want to talk about domestic violence and child abuse and church abuse and all kinds of trauma. We're going to define trauma and its characteristics. We're going to take some time to talk about adverse childhood experiences and their long term effects. And we're going to provide some biblical examples of trauma. Didn't know that, did you, that there is trauma in the Bible? We're going to consider the relevance of incorporating trauma motifs into the theological hermeneutic, and we're going to suggest some community resources that would be available to you, particular pastors who encounter these issues. At the end of this session, I hope that there's some things that you'll have a little more insight about. I hope that you'll be able to reference at least one scholar who discusses the relevance of trauma informed approaches in Bible study and preaching. I hope that you'll be able to leave here with at least 2 adverse childhood experiences and their long term effects. I pray that you'll be able to share at least 3 biblical examples of trauma. And then I hope that you'll have some insight as to how you prioritize self care for vicarious or compassion trauma. Let's get started. So, trauma is defined as a lasting emotional, psychological, or physical response to an event. 3 ways, then, in which trauma affects us: emotionally, psychologically, and physically. And it's a response to an event or a series of events or circumstances that the individual experiences as harmful or life threatening. So it's very subjective. What I experience as trauma, as life threatening to myself or harmful to myself, may not be the same as another individual's. Trauma involves, as I said, a subjective feeling of intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, resulting in lasting adverse effects on a person's functioning. So, trauma affects us in long lasting ways. Very important for us to understand, because we have a sense sometimes that when someone encounters an adverse situation or a traumatic event, that as soon as the wound is healed physically, that the trauma is resolved. And that may not be the case. So remember that definition: long lasting. Trauma can be individual, it can be acute, it can be chronic, and we now have a new designation: complex, because trauma can be one kind of thing that happened. So, my sense of seeing Sister Jolyn and trying to figure out what was going on with her would have been, for me, an acute trauma, because I wasn't dealing with it in an ongoing, chronic kind of way. And it certainly was not complex for me, because it didn't then involve my psychological and my physical well being. Trauma can be interpersonal, and we've alluded to that: abuse or interpersonal violence. The thing that we need to understand, and we hear a lot more descriptions now of dating violence. Trauma can occur in an interpersonal relationship very young in someone's life. It doesn't always have to be between people who are adults. Trauma can be collective, structural, or historical. So, as a woman of African American background, there is historical trauma that I carry just because I am African American in the United States of America. There are others who are carrying historical trauma. Our Native American brothers and sisters are carrying some historical trauma based on what happened to them. There are others who are newer to the United States of America who are now carrying structural trauma because the abuses that they are feeling have to do with how the laws have been established and how they are treated as a result of that. We've got some collective trauma that's been going on right in the area where we are now, Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I suggest that the trauma that this community has and is experiencing is going to go well beyond when troops have been removed and when people have forgotten the names of those who were killed as a result of the demonstrations. Trauma can range from acute stress, fear, and anxiety to severe situations, conditions like PTSD, which is post traumatic stress disorder, and depression. Physical conditions could include headaches or stomach pain, insomnia, and heart palpitations. So, trauma can be demonstrated in many different ways in many different individuals. We have a picture here of a child who is perhaps being removed from a home because there's been evidence of trauma, evidence of interpersonal violence or domestic violence, perhaps even evidence of child abuse. I want to talk with you about adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences. I'm going to skip ahead to this slide and go back. ACEs, as they are abbreviated, are defined as traumatic experiences that occur in childhood and teenage years. That would be children between 0 and 17 years of age. And these experiences may put children at risk for violence, chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance abuse in adulthood. And some of these things don't have to wait until adulthood to be exhibited in children who have experienced traumatic situations in their lives. ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, can also impact future violence, either as victims or perpetrators. They can impact lifelong health and opportunity. They can negatively impact education, job opportunities, and earning potential. So, ACEs as a group of indicators of traumatic experiences have in their definition the possibility and probability that they will affect young people for the rest of their lives. This is important for us as pastors to understand that people come into our congregations from many different places and they bring with themselves experiences that we don't know about, but that are residing in them psychologically, physically, emotionally, mentally, and I dare say spiritually. Now, let me go back to that slide. There are some predictive powers of ACEs, things that are statistically significant. When I worked in Boston as one of the assistant deputy commissioners of health, I was responsible for several cost centers. And I worked with many different department heads. And I'll never forget that one of the premier researchers in the area of childhood mental health, Dr. Jonathan Bass, and I had a conversation. And Dr. Bass said to me that at that time, he was able to predict, based on a child's history at 3 and 4 years old, who would be a violent perpetrator. I have never forgotten that conversation with Dr. Bath. He said they really could predict who would be perpetrators of murder based on what children had experienced early in their lives. And so we now know that ACEs can predict financial hardship. And with that, then comes poor health and improper development. Children who are victims of traumatic events sometimes have to move away from what is the family home because that is the only way to have them remain safe. And they may go with one parent or another, or be placed with kin, or move into the foster care system. That in of itself is a predictor of financial hardship or instability. Another predictive power of ACEs is that children who have lived with parents who have emotional or mental illness, their own social emotional development is stunted. And we may find that they are not age appropriate or developing appropriately just based on what the trauma is in their own lives. Children whose parents are struggling with mental illness may have attachment disorders. They may not be able to relate to their parents in the way that would be healthy and normal. And there is a realization that there are increased special health needs based sometimes on a child's genetics if they've been exposed to ACEs. And so Dr. Webster, in a large study on the adverse childhood experience and their impact on health and development, writes about that. Think about yourself as a pastor, as a leader in the church. Have there been experiences that you recall that have made you feel different, made you feel that you didn't belong? So, children who experience trauma sometimes are afraid of other people. They're afraid to interact with others. And you see that often in child welfare. Sometimes these children also have development that has been stunted. And so bedwetting could also be a symptom of a child who has experienced an ACE. Children who have difficulty showing affection is a real one. One of the roles that I held was as the executive director of an agency in New Jersey. And in that agency, we dealt with mothers who were teenage parents and their children. And very often we saw that the mothers had difficulty showing affection to their children, and the children reciprocated in the similar ways. To see a baby who is depressed is the saddest thing in the world. And yet it is true that sometimes, based on where a child is born, based on how their parents are able or unable to nurture them, you will see that children have difficulty showing affection and receiving affection. Difficulty sleeping or frequent nightmares is another way that we know that children and adults have been exposed to adverse childhood experiences. Mood changes. Children who are happy one moment and another moment they're angry. One moment they can play nicely, another moment they can't. And don't we see that there are adults who sometimes can play nicely and other times they're not able to play nicely? Learning difficulties is another indicator of an ACE. I'm now working in a school district and I see it every day. Young people who are unable to settle themselves and to focus and to get their work done. And still another indicator is avoiding situations or events that might relate or trigger a memory of a traumatic experience. So ACEs are really, really, really impactful in our lives. So, some key impacts of ACEs across the lifespan. Childhood and adolescence, we may see chronic stress, behavior problems, poor school performance, risk taking behaviors like substance abuse, smoking, or risky sex. In childhood and adolescence. In adulthood, we might see chronic illness, heart disease or cancer, obesity, or diabetes are also things that can affect folks who are dealing with trauma. In older age, we know that people who have experienced ACEs may have increased depression and disability. And the generational impact of ACEs is real. They are linked to 5 of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States. So, over the last 20 to 25 years, a lot of research has been conducted that give us information about how exposure to adverse traumatic events in childhood affect us throughout our lives. I don't think that you can see this, but on the reference sheet, you'll be able to go to the Centers for Disease Control or to one of the other sites. You'll be able to pull up the Adverse Childhood Experience Questionnaire for Adults. It's 10 questions, that's all, just 10 questions, and they begin to help us understand whether or not we ourselves have been exposed to adverse childhood experiences. Things like, did you ever feel that you didn't have enough to eat? Or you had to wear dirty clothes? Or you had no one to protect or take care of you? If that would have been you, then you would have checked that. Did you lose a parent through divorce or abandonment, death, or another reason? If that's the case for you, any one of those, you would check. Did you live with someone who was depressed or mentally ill or somehow attempted suicide? You would check for that, and so forth. There are 10 indicators here, and you would check for each one, it would be 1 point. And so if you have 1, that would be 1, or 2, that would be 2, 3, 3, and so forth. But we know that if you have 3 or more ACEs, the struggles that you're going to have in life are tremendous. So let's look at some of these long-term effects. Bessel van der Kolk talks about storing trauma in the body. in his book, The Body Keeps Score. And so he talks about mental illness, dissociative states, where you kind of separate yourself. You can be in this room, but you could be separated, and your mind and your body can be somewhere else in your thinking. Emotional flashbacks. Again, we're dealing with mental illness and the impact on you emotionally. But then we're talking about fatigue, and you see that's pointed at the heart. Chronic fatigue, you just never seem to be able to get rested, or startling or arousal responses. You're just jumpy all the time. You can't be in a place that's unfamiliar without looking around and feeling that something may be happening. Somatic flashbacks. You remember that you used to get a pain in your side or in your near your heart, or lingering physical pain. Some people have so much pain and they can't describe where it's coming from, and doctors can't always do a test to figure out what it could be or diagnose it. Immune system distresses, hunger and digestive distresses, non epileptic seizures. So, some people have seizure disorders and they come suddenly, muscle problems, weight gain, weight loss. The body keeps the score. So in our bodies, we carry the residual effects of stress and trauma. Let's look at other health disorders. Depressive disorder, COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. We used to think that was only because you were smoking. Well, not necessarily. You can get COPD because you're living in an environment where there's toxicity in the air and it's affecting your lungs. Asthma, kidney disease, stroke. Look at the list. It goes on and on and on. And the percentages are clear that ACEs show up 44% of the time in mental illness. And then it goes from there to diseases of the lungs, the heart, the kidneys. Then there are health risk behaviors, smoking, heavy drinking, and we ought to include here as well substance use disorder. And then there are socioeconomic challenges. If you've grown up and you've been depressed or sick or unable to learn, you're looking at no high school diploma, unemployment, and therefore no health insurance. All kinds of things that happen as a result of ACEs. So the long-term effects, according to recent data, that we may have up to 21 million cases of depression in our country, 1.9 million cases of heart disease, and 2.5 million cases of persons who are overweight or dealing with obesity or even eating disorders. Did you ever think that that could be a case when you're dealing with people in your pastorate who are having struggles? So, what's your ACE score? These are those same things again. Have you ever had a parent who's been incarcerated? All these children whose parents are being taken away and incarcerated in immigrant detention centers, these children now are dealing with a trauma that they never imagined. What about domestic abuse in the household? Or have you experienced sexual abuse? Were you emotionally abused or neglected? Did your parents yell, scream, curse at you, tell you that you would never be anything? Have you lived with someone who has abused substances? Did you have parents who were separated or divorced? How about family members who were mentally ill or suicidal? Or were you physically abused as a child? Or were your basic needs neglected? Sometimes as pastors, we have to realize that we too bring situations from our own path into our work situations. So let's go on. What are my premises in talking with us today about trauma? Number one, I believe that understanding trauma can lead to preaching in a more full context or a fuller context. I think that it's important for us to realize that people in the Bible dealt with trauma. And it is critical that we integrate a trauma perspective into preaching because it will enhance the relevancy of the gospel. I'm making some huge claims and I plan to address them today. Why is this so important? It is important. Seems that to touch my machine here, my slides go way too far. All right. It's important because we work with people. Pastors are not working in isolation. We're working with people. And people live in contexts other than the church. They don't only come to church on Sunday or midweek, but they're living outside of that in situations that can be very hurtful. It's important because people are hurting and because people need help and support. We've been talking about that a lot in this conference. Parakleo. People need support, they need help, they need encouragement. And people need to know that God is with them, that they are not in their context alone. Dealing with trauma as pastors is important because we are charged to love with the love of God. It's important because we are responsible for the souls of men and women and young people and children and babies. We are responsible for souls. There's no larger responsibility on earth than for caring for the souls of people. It's important that we understand this because we want to preach sound doctrine. And we need to understand context and how it relates to the Word of God. You say, Pastor Z, what are you talking about? I need to understand trauma. Yes, you do need to understand trauma. Let me show you some other things. All right, so there are some folks in the Bible who dealt with trauma. So let's look at Cain and Abel. And Cain kills Abel, and the scripture talks about Abel's spirit just kind of crying out from the grave. Trauma cries out from the grave. Abel wasn't present anymore, and Cain went away, a dejected, forlorn person. But the trauma of killing his brother cried out from the grave. What about Noah and Noah's sons? After God protected them and brought them back and set the rainbow in the sky, there's a passage in the scripture where Noah gets drunk and his one son looks on his father's nakedness. and thinks that it's funny and talks to his brothers about that. And the brothers rebuke him because that was something that they should not see, the nakedness of their father. And so Ham was condemned because of that. Now, the whole story of Hagar and Abraham and Ishmael is an issue in itself. I remember very clearly having my hand smacked in seminary as I looked at this story, and I thought, well, let me just see what's going on here. Well, Hagar is an Egyptian girl, and she's young, and she's a slave, so she has no agency, and she's given to a man who's at least 80 years old so that she can deliver for him a child to pacify a wife who was despondent that she wasn't able to produce. And that's in the Bible. That's all exactly true. A young maiden given to an old man so that she could produce offspring. And she had no agency. She could not say, I don't want to do this. She could not say, well, what is in it for me? Am I going to be elevated somehow? Will I be treated better as a result of doing this thing that Sarah wants? And you have Abraham in the middle, who somehow could not stand up to Sarah and caved in and did as his wife wished. But you have Hagar, who was placed on a beast of burden with just enough food for a few days and water for a few days, with her baby son. Well, with her son. He's probably around 8 or 10 by then. And they are sent off into the forest, into the desert, where they're going to die. Abraham did that. Abraham did that. It seems as though he was torn because he loved his son. And the Lord said to him, I'm going to make that son a great nation as well. But what I want us to see is that there was trauma surrounding that whole story. And we talk about Abraham and Ishmael and Hagar, but not very much. We might talk about Hagar being uh, kind of a smarty and deciding that she could speak out against her mistress. But we don't address the issue that this was trauma. A girl ripped away from her homeland, brought to someplace else, and given to someone to bear a child. But what about the trauma in the Sarah, Isaac, and Abraham story? Sarah did, in fact, have a baby, and I'm sure she doted on her baby. But the trauma is that Abraham is asked to give up that baby. And so he prepares, as he believes God has directed him, a burnt offering, and the burning offering was going to be Isaac. The trauma. This little boy said, Daddy, we've got the altar all prepared. Where is the offering? Where's the animal? Where's the animal? He speaks out of just wanting to understand what is going to happen. Daddy, what's going to happen next? And Daddy says, God will provide the offering. As it occurred, God did in fact provide the offering. But there's some trauma going on there because Abraham is walking up that road and he's walking up with great misgivings. I doubt that he had told Sarah what he believed God had said to him. And he's walking up and he says to the servants, "You stay here and we're coming back." And he keeps going slowly, slowly. It's not just an archetype of Jesus on the road to Calvary, but it is exactly what this man was struggling with as he's dealing with what does it mean if I give up he who is so dear to me? What kind of trauma do we experience when we have children who have been so wayward, children who may be addicted to substances, children who have run away and turned their back on the things of God? And we have to relinquish them. We have to give them up. It is a very difficult and a traumatic situation for us. And so we need to look at the trauma in this story and somehow relate it so that our listeners can understand that God makes a way even in the times that we have to relinquish those who we love the most. And what about Ruth and Naomi? That's a story that many commentators say is just a little pastoral story. I suggest to you that it is a story about trauma. Trauma of a woman who left with her husband her homeland to go to another place because there was a famine in the land. And they did well there, and the famine then was over in their land. And the famine then came to the new homeland. And Ruth and Naomi started back to where Naomi came from. But while Naomi was there, she had trauma upon trauma upon trauma. Do we ever speak to this story from that vantage point? Here is a woman whose husband died, her sons who were to take care of her, one died, then the other died. She had no future to look forward to. She had to have been depressed. She had to have been distraught. She didn't know what she was going to do. All she could think of was maybe if I get back home, something would happen that I wouldn't starve to death. But she's going to have to travel a long way. And Ruth decided to come alongside her. Ruth, the Moabitess, travels with her. And when Naomi gets to her homeland, she says, "Don't call me by my name anymore. Call me Mara. Call me bitter, because God has dealt with me bitterly." And we would say, now she ought to know better than that. God has been good to her. Don't we tell people that? She ought to know better than that. He ought to know better than that. God has been so faithful to them. And what? Trauma on trauma on trauma? And people should just get over it? Doesn't happen like that. Now, I want to talk to you about two others. You know, all these others are also, they've got trauma embedded in their stories. Every single one of them. And so I'd like for us to begin to think about traumatic indicators when we read some of these scriptures. Now, Lot's wife has to be my all-time favorite. She has to be. Because we in the church have preached about Lot's wife. She doesn't even have a name. We've preached about her and we've denigrated her big time. So what I learned in seminary, and I knew it before I went to seminary, but that we have to look at the context. Well, to look at the context in this circumstance, you have to go all the way back to Ur of Chaldea when Lot, whose father had died, traveled with his uncle, Abraham, Abram at the time. And they traveled from Ur of Chaldea all the way around various places. They went to Canaan for a while. So, you know, the children of Israel were in Canaan before they left and came back to Canaan, by the way. But that's another story. But you've got Lot and his wife moving from place to place to place. They were nomads. And every place they went, they seemed to amass more things. Isn't that how it is in our lives? Every time we move, we take what we have and we get a few more things. Well, they ended up with a lot of things. As I counted, they probably moved about 4 times in scripture. 4 times. And moving 4 times with 300 people in your household that you're responsible for, all the servants and all their children, all of the people who work the farm and who work with the herds that you now own. She was managing an internal corporation. And then her husband decided that where his uncle was residing, he didn't want to be. So he thought that he was seeing a place that was more appealing. And he says, okay, I want to move somewhere else. And his uncle says, you take whichever area you want, and I will keep what's left. So by the time all of this happens, and then Lot gets carried away by people who live there already, he gets carried away and held hostage, and she's there holding down the fort. And then Lot comes back, and if I'm not mistaken, they move a little bit a ways again. And then they move to a place that is ripe with sin. And the angel of the Lord sends messengers to get them out of that circumstance. And so here these people come into her home. She doesn't know who they are. And they say, you got to get out of here. You got to get out of here. You can't take anything and you can't look back. You got to get out. And Lot tells them they have to go. He, his wife, and their 2 daughters. She gets out and she looks back and she becomes frozen, a pillar of salt. Trauma has a way of freezing us. If we can't get over it fast enough, we're just stuck. And so I don't denigrate Lot's wife. I use that experience as an example to say when people deal with trauma, they get stuck. They may not be able to move. She couldn't do more than just glance back and say, here I go again, and where to this time? And I'm going to have to start all over again. We denigrate her and we say nothing about Lot, who left that situation also traumatized, and he got drunk. You think that might be how he dealt with his trauma? He got so drunk that he didn't know that his daughters were coming in to sleep with him. This is in the Bible. And the girls each became pregnant with their father's children. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about how trauma messes you up. You don't know where you are. You don't know whether up is up and down is down. And you soothe yourself with things that really are going to destroy you. And so he, as far as we know, never did return to Canaan, but he went to another place, Moab and Ammon, and those are where the descendants of Lot are to this day. We miss out on what God may have for us because trauma has immobilized us and caused us not to be able to move beyond where we are, or has gotten us to a point that we try to ourselves find a way to soothe the pain that we've experienced. So, yes, when I have preached Lot's wife, I preach it from a trauma informed lens. I'm always running over. I run over if I'm in with the group, I run over if I'm online. But we're going to get through this quickly. Job. Pastors' views of trauma. As a student, I was always interested in this whole issue of trauma. And I was interested in Job and was, in fact, taking a course in Job taught by a Dr. C. Seow, who was one of the most foremost experts on Job in the world. His commentary must be 2,000 pages, all on Job. Well, I thought that it was very important to understand what pastors thought about Job. So I put together a proposal to do a study and to try to ascertain how pastors thought about Job and Job's circumstances. I was able to get permission to do that, and some pastors were willing to answer an anonymous survey. I don't know who responded, but I sent it out to a number of pastors. And you're going to get to see today the views of these pastors about trauma. So I asked a question of the pastors as to what they thought was trauma or traumatic circumstances. About 37 pastors responded to my survey. That would have been just about 30 to 35% of the surveys, which was really a very good number. So I wondered if sickness might be considered traumatic, or tragic death of a loved one, job loss, or family problems, or mental stress, or go on, go on, go on. These are the numbers that came out. Pastors didn't think of sickness or family problems or financial downturns as traumatic. And I thought, oh, okay. I had lost a job that I really wanted to be in until I retired. That was pretty traumatic for me. And they didn't seem to believe that that could be a traumatic circumstance in my life and my husband's life. But they did think that, well, maybe some economic stress would be cause to be depressed. Maybe some mental stress. But look at that, mental stress is very low, 7%, 8%. Unexplained ongoing troubles, that could be traumatic. And then they just lump things into other. I don't know what other is. All I know is that these things that I think might be traumatic, the pastors didn't think were all that much. Shall I tell you more? So I wondered what pastors emphasized when they talked to people who were struggling. And the colored lines connect to things that I asked them about. So pastors absolutely think that their emphasis should be on raising hope. The highest number is here to listen, to evaluate the extent of the pain and refer to counseling. They actually said that. So they see that being present and listening is important. The next highest was to apply the Bible truth to the situation. So always they want to apply Bible truth. But how do they do that? We might see. And then the last thing is to raise hope. So that's the pastoral emphasis. And that's good, right? That's what pastors should do. But does hope come through the preach word too? Does hope come besides just sitting there? Does hope come because you have taught people all along that they can hope in God even in the midst of distress? Some pastors don't feel very comfortable in this role of supporting people. Some of them don't feel very able to do that. 15% of pastors feel somewhat uncomfortable in dealing with people who have ongoing struggles, though 85% of the pastors said that they didn't have too much problem. I was going through some marital difficulty years ago, which led to a divorce. And I'll say to you, pastors, a Bible order divorce, because I know we get really fixated on why people divorce. I was going through this period and I was very, very, very down, very depressed. I thought I would die. I thought I would, and so did those close to me. And a pastor asked me whether I had done everything that I was supposed to do as a godly wife. I'm dejected, depressed, feeling like I'm going to die, embarrassed and humiliated. And the question that I get, did you do everything that you were supposed to do? I was a strong Christian. How would that resonate with someone who was not so strong? That was hurtful to me. And yet, this is a pastor who probably would have thought that they were supporting me. What we say to people and how we say to people can take them further into depression, or do as in our previous slide, help them have hope. I asked pastors what might be helpful to them. And I was pleased to see that they felt that there were some materials that, were they available, they might take advantage of. So, adult Bible study materials, youth curricula, young adult materials, but pastor study tools. Pastors felt that if they understood more, they could do more. Wonderful web based studies or other. So, pastors wanted to learn then, and I suggest the pastors still want to learn, and we should still offer opportunities for that. Now, the other part of the study was to look at parishioners and to see if there was a disconnect or an alignment between what pastors were saying and what parishioners were thinking. So I asked people, how often do you hear preaching from the book of Job? And the response was, I don't hear preaching from the book of Job very often, because there's more focus on the New Testament. And so I read Job if it's included in devotional materials, though it's rare. Now, there's another slide. I don't know if it's in here, but I did have a slide that pastors responded to how often they used the book of Job in their preaching. And if I recall correctly, some of them might preach once a year, maybe twice a year from the book of Job. Some people preached from the book of Job maybe once or twice every 2 to 3 years, and some rarely preached from the book of Job. That's consistent with what the parishioner is saying. So I then asked the parishioner, what do you think constitutes suffering? And I put the same indicators there. And they said sickness, yeah, that's suffering. Tragic death, yes, that's suffering. Job loss and economic stress, yes, because they worry about sustenance, how they're going to sustain themselves. Family problems, marital problems, children, yes, because a sense of feeling alone and worried about the children, yep, that's important to them. Financial downturn, yes, and then ours was a zero from pastors. And mental stress, yes. And we had only a few pastors who thought mental stress was suffering. And this is what the parishioner said, there's no preaching on these areas. And there should be, as it could help strengthen faith. This is what the people who we're talking to think. Theologically, how do you regard suffering? And the parishioner says that the grace of God sustains. The word of God promises never to leave or forsake. But they sometimes question, how can this be? Well, that's appropriate. Job did that. Job questioned God. And pastors were pretty in alignment on this. How have pastors and ministers helped you during great trials? Listen to this, pastors. No pastoral visitation. No pastor, no ministers, no deacons ever came to sit with them. And what did we see? That people need, they need somebody to come and sit and listen. And didn't the pastor say that that's what they do? And this parishioner says, well, I've been through a lot of things. Nobody ever came. I spoke to a pastor this morning who's been a pastor for a number of years and has gone through so many tragedies within the last year. And she cried and said, "Nobody has touched me. Nobody has put their hand on my shoulder. No one has come to sit with me. Not a colleague, not my own pastor." Pastors, we think that we're doing a job when we stand to preach the word. The data suggests that we have to do more than preach the word. Do you believe that depression is a valid response to suffering? Yes. And there should be a class on depression. We need to deal with it. So much is happening. We need to be taught how to cope. If pastors don't understand trauma, if they don't understand that depression is an outgrowth of trauma, then they can't do a complete job in teaching and preaching what our parishioners are saying they need. What kinds of things would be helpful to you? Same question I asked the pastors. The pastors say, "Give me some resources." The parishioner says, "Show some love, show some care, touch me, call me, come, visit, sit, touch." I thought this was interesting. Have a prayer service where we can give our prayer requests. We used to do that. We don't anymore. They said a prayer service where I could stand up and give my prayer requests. So, what have I to say to you? There are some conclusions that I think that are important. I think that you've got to preach contextually. Read the whole story and ask God for discernment in the stories that we read from the Bible. These exchanges in the Old and New Testament. Read them contextually. Read the passages over and over. See the people who are in those passages. And then begin to preach how trauma intersects with the gospel. It does. And in so doing, it will relate to the people that you're talking to. You know, I think that Jacob wrestling with that angel probably has more context to it than we have ever given it. You see, Jacob knew that to steal his brother's birthright was the improper thing to do. He knew that. And he tried to say that to his mother, but he was forced to give in to her demands. But this is the same woman who left her family, stole the idols from the father, and then had her husband get stopped and accused of stealing them. So this is that same woman who says to her son, "You go and steal your brother's birthright." So I think that that interaction with that angel could have been Jacob working out the trauma, working out the guilt, working out the despair. You know how I know? Because if you read on in that chapter, as he's on his way back home, he's fearful that when he sees Esau, Esau is going to recall that and do harm to him. Look at the whole context. Maybe there's something else there because these are people. They're not just Bible characters, they're people. Or what about Abigail? Did anybody ever think about Abigail? Well, I thought Abigail was pretty, all that. Because they said she was beautiful and she was smart and she ran her own businesses and she did a whole lot of things and she was married to an alcoholic. She was married to an alcoholic whose possessions had been protected by David and his armies, and he didn't even want to give them anything to eat or drink. And when that word got back to Abigail and her uh, CEO mentality, she said, "Oh, I can fix this because Nabal is a fool. His name means fool. I'll fix this right now." And she went ahead and she fixed things. She was dealing with an alcoholic husband. Did you know that about Abigail? When we studied about Abigail as one of the women in the Bible, she was dealing with trauma. And if we as pastors can see that there's trauma. I've talked about Ruth and Naomi, but I want us to begin to help people know how to deal with trauma. I want us to learn about it, pastors. There are ways to learn. I want you to begin to explore biblical trauma narratives. They are in the Bible. Preach theologically. Don't give up preaching the Word of God theologically, but I want us to add the hermeneutically sound portion to it. When I got slapped on my hands at Princeton, they didn't really deter me from understanding that I had to read scripture in context and that I could not impose anything on scripture, but from the scripture understand what was going on in that culture. Pastors, you have to cultivate a safe environment for trauma victims and survivors. You must do that. As a clinician, that's what I'm taught, that when someone comes into my space, into my office, they have to feel that their connection with me is one that is authentic and it is safe, and that they can expose their deepest, darkest fears to me. Our churches have got to be a place where people feel safe. You have to evaluate your own trauma. I've been a little bit uh, open and transparent with you today. You don't know the whole story, but you know that I've had some trauma. And I haven't used that trauma in order to promote my trauma, but to use the trauma to understand how others may be experiencing their own circumstances. There's something that you've got to know about trauma. And so, one of the objectives I gave you, you'll probably not be able to fulfill because I haven't had a chance to tell you about some of these articles that talk about trauma, but they are on my reference list. But the reality is that you don't forget about what has happened to you, that trauma can take on a life of its own. And what you have to be able to do is to not let the trauma continue to have power over you. I like what Bessel van der Kolk wrote in his book. He says that he speaks to patients and he lets them know, yes, these are things that have happened to you. They are not happening now. So don't allow the trauma to have power. The trauma that the people here in Minneapolis have experienced as a community, what this will be etched into their collective memory for decades to come. But what we want them to understand is that that does not have to define them as Minnesotans. It doesn't have to define them as people from the community of Minneapolis, that it is something that did happen and it happened to them. And by God's grace, they were able to see it come to a different kind of resolution. It's important for pastors to know when to ask for help. Very often, pastors believe that they can handle everything because sometimes the church makes you believe that you can handle everything. Everything is not yours to handle. And so I would like to encourage you to get to know your community, get to know the resources in your community so that you know where to turn for help when things are beyond your praying and your fasting and your counseling. And I'd like for pastors to understand that vicarious or compassion trauma happens. Understand that you cannot allow yourself to become so immersed to a point that you become enmeshed in someone else's trauma. You have to always um, ask the Lord to give you discernment and to give you spiritual distance so that you can care for others. This has been a tremendous privilege and opportunity to share with you this afternoon. And I have a reference sheet that's available to you. If you uh, click on the QR code, it will take you to it. And my information is there. Feel free to email me. And if you want to talk with me or have me come and do a conference or a workshop in your congregation, I'm really open to doing that. It's important to teach so that we preach sound doctrine and hermeneutically correct gospel. Thank you so much for taking time this afternoon to join me as we walk alongside others who have extremely experienced trauma. God bless you.
Reverend Zuline, wow. Can I just say that it's been a privilege to sit here and for you to share the wealth of wisdom that you have and the passion that you have to help the church and pastors be informed on how to better walk alongside families that have been impacted by abuse, neglect, by childhood trauma, and even adult trauma. I want to close with one question before we let you go, but I want to encourage you viewers to check out her reference sheet to really do that work to be informed on how we can do a better job of being informed and understanding how to minister to people that had been, have experienced those traumas and ACEs. I think for me, just understanding that we can also be learners of people. I can ask, I can go to the best resources, but I can also go to people and ask them for feedback. It's important to realize that when we are preaching and we're using a certain volume because we get excited. That sometimes that volume is traumatic to people that have experienced some form of verbal abuse. That sometimes when we go to pray for people and we're used to just instantly putting our hand on their shoulder, and we've got to ask them for permission.
May I have permission?
Absolutely. So we can be learners of people, and going to the people is sometimes the best source of how to make sure that we're informed of how they want to be approached, right?
Yes.
So my question for you, because I really wish I could ask you 12 questions, but here's my question, because you're right, as pastors, we often experience secondary trauma
Yes, you do.
because we're walking alongside them and hearing their tragic stories. So how did you, Zuline, protect yourself when people would, maybe they would lash out at you, maybe their brokenness would bleed out as they're, coming to you for help and support? How do we as pastors protect ourselves as we continue to provide care for people that have been experienced by?
And I have had that experience of pouring into the lives of others and then having them seemingly walk away. But because I understand responses to trauma, I accept it and I realize that that's a response. It's reactionary. It may not be how they really feel. Now, in the training that I've had as a social worker, one thing that's always built in is supervision. So as a clinician, you always have someone with whom you can talk about
Absolutely.
cases that you're dealing with, your feelings about the cases.
Mm.
And that's helpful. That's built in to my training as a social worker. And unfortunately, it's not so much on the other side as
Right.
a pastor. Seminary doesn't do this at all. We did have at our seminary a counseling center, but sometimes I felt that that wasn't a place where I could go. So
Mhm.
this is what mm, Dr. Bo Karen Lee. Dr. Bo Karen Lee is she calls herself a spiritual um, theologian.
Mhm.
I loved her courses. And she said that you need to have at least 5 people
Yeah.
that you can walk along with. These are your peers
Right, that walk alongside
that
you.
walk alongside you.
Yes.
And those are people that you trust to talk to about what you're feeling and the struggles that you have and how you're coping and dealing with certain situations.
Right.
So you want to always be mindful that you don't want to um, destroy someone's trust in you.
Mhm.
So you want to be confidential, but you absolutely can talk about how you're feeling
Right.
if you have a few pastors
Yes.
that you can walk alongside.
Absolutely.
Or I know sometimes in our particular um, penchant, we don't think therapy is good, but I think that it's all right to have someone with
Yes.
whom you speak who's not in the church
Absolutely.
or a colleague that you don't want to reveal to.
Right.
So you have to have a place where you can speak.
Thank you. Thank you for that encouragement. You have encouraged my heart. I received that. I feel like I wish you were one of my 5 people. I have safe,
Yes,
trusted people to
yes,
process with, but I wish that you were one of those people because I just feel that in you.
mm,
And you're like Jesus with flesh on, right? Because Jesus was the ultimate man of sorrow. He was familiar with suffering, right?
absolutely.
His ministry of compassion, which compassion means literally to sit with suffering. And there's just something about that which is just so profound. So thank you. Can I
Well,
call you
thank you.
Pastor Z? Pastor
I'm
Z?
Pastor Z.
Thank
I'm an
you.
associate pastor, yes.
Yes.
And my responsibility in my congregation is teaching. We have a Bible
Mhm.
Institute, and that falls under my rubric. So
Oh.
I'm so grateful that I get a chance to teach and preach.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you were blessed. Go to her QR code, check out those resources. You're not alone. Find at least 5 trusted people. If you don't have people that you can process with, go and find those people. And we want to invite you to just also consider partnering with us by giving today. And we want you to know that as you give, that every part of that money is being used to help others to be resourced, to be equipped, to be encouraged, to be able to continue to live out the call of ministry that God has placed on our lives.
Yeah.
And tonight I want to remind you to come back. Our next live stream session is at 6:30 p.m. We're going to get to hear from Reverend Alexandra Moon, one of the Free Methodist pastors from Southern California, where I'm from, one of my dear friends. And we're also going to be interviewing the Salvation Army officers tonight. So make sure to join us again at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. And you can also go to our live stream schedule at womanclergyconference.com/live stream to check out everything that we've got lined up for tomorrow. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you right back here at 6:30.